Good morning. Gosh, I'm getting ready to be in tears. Thank you, Hubert. So, I'm really, really privileged and honored to be here. I thank you so much, the Brimmer community, head of school, Judy Guile, the co-chair people of the PTA. I thank my parents, my dad, my mother-in-law, Beatrice, and Hubert Williams are here. My mom, hopefully, is on her way. But this is an extreme privilege for me to share this time and just some of my thoughts with you. Now, how many of you have ever had kind of something happen in your life that you feel is that defining moment, that there's something that you relate to that experience that changes the trajectory of your life? Anyone? Yeah. So Hubert comes by the storytelling, we both come by the storytelling approach, actually very honestly. Our dad is a journalist. And one of the interesting things when Hubert talks about that time at Johns Hopkins, it was actually my first week at Johns Hopkins University, and as a foreign student at the time, I knew I wanted to do medicine. That was pretty clear. And so I went to the advisor to say, hey, I'm here, ready to go. Show me the ropes, tell me what I need to do. This is someone who's extremely experienced. And those were the words that she told me. She basically cut my legs off before I started. But interestingly enough, and let me just kind of take you back a little bit, because many of you, know Hubert, and you know that Hubert is someone who all of you probably know a lot about. He will talk to you about anything for hours because he has an incredible fund of knowledge. And this actually reminds me of a story that my dad told when we were growing up. We were about 3 years old. My dad took us on a journey to London. And he was coming out of Guyana. And to get to London from Guyana, we actually had to fly from Georgetown. They went to the Canary Islands, and then from the Canary Islands to London. And in typical fashion, Hubert Jr. sat next to a family. It was a woman and her daughter. And he talked to them for the entire time. So by the time they got to the Canary Islands, that mother actually made an offer to my dad for Hubert. And when you talk about those defining moments, I thank you, Dad, for not accepting that offer because there were a couple things that would have happened. One is that my mom would have killed you, which meant that she would have been in jail for the rest of her life, which meant that Hubert would not have been here at Brimmer, which consequently meant that I wouldn't be here. And so I thank you, Dad. Speaking about Mom, unfortunately she's not here at this time, but I just think of her not much bigger than I am, very petite, carrying 14 pounds of baby. And I could just think back to that years ago, and staggering into the maternity ward of the Georgetown Hospital and being literally her legs swollen, and getting into that maternity ward and being told just before she delivered. Sound effects. Being told just before she delivered that she was expecting twins. Up until that time, all she knew, all my parents knew, was that she was having one child. And Hubert came out first, and I was the surprise. I was that second surprise. And I think I've continued to be a surprise. I mean, we've all both lived up to, our childhood, kind of personas. But there again, that experience is being raised as a twin. Because my parents knew nothing about twins, we had no twins in our family, essentially, they raised us as almost one entity, which means that we got exposed to the same things, we had the same opportunities, we went to elementary school together, the expectations were the same, our friends were the same. I mean, essentially, I grew up with a brother, but having the expectation that there was no difference between him and me. And so that for me was another sort of defining experience, because what happened in the Caribbean, and we moved from Guyana to Barbados, what happened after and just here's an example. You know, look, we have the same shoes, the same water bottle. I mean, we literally were raised in the exact same way. And in the Caribbean, the better schools tended to be single-sex schools. So after we completed elementary school and we transitioned to high school, what was our high school at 10 or 11, I went off to a girls' school, and Hubert went off to a boys' school. And then we moved from Guyana to Barbados and continued in that vein. I went to the all-girls school, and he went to the all-boys school. And in that transition, during that first year in school in Barbados, I felt a call. It was actually an experience, and I'm not going to go into it because I could tell story after story after story, but suffice to say that there was an experience that I had with an encounter with one of the students, the girl students, that just embedded in my heart. I knew in that moment that I wanted to take care of people and I wanted to be a doctor. And so think about almost, I liken it to Hubert and I being on two separate buses. I was on the girls' school bus, and he was on the boys' bus. And everyone on my bus was happy. I mean, we were thrilled, we were going on the bus every day, getting back to school, back and forth, and we were happy and content until the moment that in deciding that I wanted to do medicine, what I discovered was that I needed to do physics as a subject. And on the girls' school bus, okay. On the girls' school bus, you can see physics was not offered. And so in that moment, I have to admit, I was a little confused, a little conflicted, because I couldn't understand this notion that Hubert was having access to something different than I was. And if you think about the bus analogy, and I'm going to go to, the bus stops for the girls were, you know, traditional teacher, librarian, cook, secretary, managers, store clerk. And the options for the boys led to doctor and mathematician and scientist and engineer. And so I actually had this experience where all of a sudden there was a stop that I wanted to get off on that was not a stop that the girls' school bus was going to be stopping at. And so, what to do? I had to raise my hand. And I had to raise my hand to say, listen up. There is a stop on the bus that I'd like to go to that this bus doesn't stop on, but I need to get to this other bus stop. And so I needed to raise my hand, state the question, state the concern, because these were my dreams. And so what happened is that it was not that the girls who went to that girls' school never ever did any of those, made it to those stops, such as the engineer and mathematician, etc. But what it meant was that the work to get there was probably 10 times what it took for the boys to get to their destination. And interestingly enough, you know, the status quo is that you don't know what you don't know until you know. None of the girls who had previously been on the bus had ever actually raised their hand to say, something does not seem right. And so when you talk about sort of limits being applied and the defining moments that actually bring you directly into contact with a difference, with a limit that is placed upon you, this was the first place that I encountered it. And what was it about my experience that allowed me, that empowered me to raise my hand and say, something does not seem right. Now, part of when I talk about an ecosystem, we'll talk about it in a little bit, it really is the linking and the interconnection of us all. And so what happened is that when I got off of that boys' bus and got off of the girls' bus and jetted over to the boys' bus, here were the teachers, the staff, the entire community, my parents who were major advocates, but cheering me on, because even though we were in a culture that had said, this is what girls do, this is what boys do, there was still an open-mindedness once the point had been made and a readiness to actually embrace change. And so what happened in raising my hand is not only did I then have the opportunity to pursue physics, where I then transferred to the class where my brother, Hubert, was a student. And so I became the first girl in that class, not just to take physics, but actually to do my entire rest of my education in a class of all boys. So one can imagine that that's a talk in itself, but I'm not going to go into details. But basically what it allowed for, it allowed then the door to be opened for other girls who wanted to pursue careers or had interests that included physics as a prerequisite. It allowed those doors to be open for those students to get on. And so what was it in the environment that even allowed for that to be possible? You know, we define culture as a group of sort of shared attitudes, shared beliefs, shared practices that characterize an institution or an organization. And at the center of this graphic are the values that essentially define the culture. So the culture in the Caribbean at that time, and still is really, was a culture that really, really revered education. That education was the path to success. And the importance of education and the importance of access to education, public education really was the best. Best schools were public schools. The access to that education was the most important consideration within the culture. And so what it meant was that even though there had been practices and rituals that did not necessarily invite or acknowledge that girls needed to have certain types of access, once the point was made that education, that this person's education is being limited, there was a wholehearted support. And quite frankly, I would have never made it through that all-boys school were it not for the overwhelming support that I had within the community, because the recognition is that culture is fluid. Culture is constantly changing. Our values are informed by progress, and as a result, we have to be open to shifting and we have to be open to change. And that is what happened for me in the all-boys school. And that was really the defining moment that for me really embedded in my psyche, in my heart, that I would continue to be an advocate, would continue to be a representative, would continue to be a voice, would continue to be an example for what is possible when you actually embrace completely that you do not allow yourself to be limited by constructs that have been put in place. That ultimately, when we think about living a life without limits, we're living a life from the inside out. And the inside out means that our hearts have unlimited capacity to love and to make choices. And our minds, we have the unlimited capacity to think, to dream, and to have this incredible, rich imagination. And so if we think about our unlimited life as basically the already unlimited potential that all of us have inside of us, it really drives how you behave and what you believe, because it takes you to this place where you actually, if you think it, and we've seen so many examples of that in technology and in science and in medicine, if you think it, then certainly it is possible. So during that boys' school experience, there were a number of, I'd say practices that I extracted from that experience that have really been, kind of the principles by which I live, which have really contributed to my ability to do the things that I have done, to be able to think outside of the box, to be able to push against the limits and push against beliefs that tell you otherwise, that tell you you can't, that tell you you don't belong, that tell you you're not supposed to do that. And the 5 habits are: there's always a solution, you have to work to find it. And essentially, these really come from a place of creating a sense of being empowered, because positivity has gotten kind of a bad rap. Most people will think about positivity as meaning that, you gloss over all the negative things, you always approach life with everything is always positive, and you essentially deny yourself the opportunity to experience what is the reality in which we live, which is that you're going to have your ups, you're going to have your downs, you're going to have good days, you're going to have bad days. And positivity does not mean that you essentially just rah, 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 and that nothing ever goes wrong, and that you never allow yourself to actually interact and engage with when things do go wrong. What do you do to really bring yourself out of it? And positivity, the detractors of positivity really, I think, has come from this position and platform that positivity has become commercialized. Like so many things in, our capitalistic world, proponents of positivity or people who have been, big advocates have actually found ways to create a commodity. And all the bumper stickers that essentially say, the world is all rose-colored, everything is bright, everything is great, and that has been the driving force. But in actuality, when you live a life from a perspective and from a culture of positivity, what you're actually saying is that you are acknowledging that there are going to be things that are going to go wrong, but that ultimately you have to make a choice about how it is that you cope, that you develop a mindset, that you develop a set of practices that empower you to come out of whatever the low is and decide on how it's going to serve you. Because ultimately, we live our life and we continue to live our life day after day. And so if we allow the waves and the winds of life to really get us down and we never have mechanisms to pick ourselves up, then we end up in a situation where we're unfortunately seeing rise of suicide, and suicide becoming depression and anxiety becoming more and more common and prevalent in certain populations in which we live. So my habits, if there's a problem, I believe that there's a solution. And so I will, whatever it requires in terms of innovation, in terms of creativity, in terms of whatever it takes, making use of my resources, I believe that is possible. If I encounter a limit, I turn it into an opportunity. As Hubert said, when that advisor at Hopkins told me that I could not possibly get into an American medical school, she literally lit the fire under me. And I was clear that was the one thing that was going to drive me to be successful. When we have the positives and the negatives, what do we do with the negatives? We process it, we understand that we're encountering a negative, but then how do we actually let it go? How do we learn from it, and how do we use it to inform, our experiences rather than carrying it with us? How do we all understand that no matter what our circumstances are, that we are actually all here for a purpose? I firmly believe that our common purpose is intimately linked to caring for one another and for caring for the world in which we live. Like that is why at the very core that we're here. And so if you're not doing something that aligns with caring for someone other than yourself, that is actually recognizing that the world and that we are part of a world that is bigger than ourselves, then it is so important, and the research shows that when you actually connect to that bigger construct, that it really fuels this feeling of I am actually important and my presence here makes a difference. And then to live from this place of gratitude where whatever we encounter, how can we extract the things that we can be thankful for, at the same time that we're acknowledging that yes, there are things and that there are times that are tough. And the data, as Judy said, the studies will show that positivity impacts on health, it impacts on mental and physical health, it impacts on productivity. We have all of those, the data that supports that when you actually approach something with a positivity mindset, that you're actually more likely to be successful. And so I think about positivity and these habits of positivity almost as a pendulum, where the pendulum and the habits live right here, right in the resting point of the pendulum. And so as life takes you out to the swing of the pendulum, what happens if you are living with these habits of positivity is that eventually the pendulum swing doesn't take you all the way to the extreme or all the way to the other extreme. The swings become shorter, and so you are able to come back to center much more effectively and much more quickly when you're practicing these habits of positivity. And so in the world in which we live, I mean, like we've all gotten, I think we've bought into, and certainly as parents, we've bought into this very sort of high pressure external definition of success, which is, what do you do? Where do your kids go to school? Where do you go to college? How much money do you make? What neighborhood do you live in? I mean, all of these metrics that have become definitions of success that have literally taken from the inside and have squarely placed our value on the outside. And as we think about establishing a positivity culture for our kids and recognizing that so many of the changes that we're seeing in our children's emotional and mental health is in part related to the external pressures that they have been subjected to for multiple reasons. I mean, we can go from social media to, all of the various kind of expectations related to performance, whether it's in sports, in academics, and how kids are internalizing those types of pressures and becoming much more prone to the types of mental health issues that we're seeing, creating a growing concern for our population. And so for me, when I think about what success is, success really becomes, are we raising physically, emotionally, and mentally healthy kids who will turn into productive adults, who will have an understanding of how they use their gifts, their talents, and their skills to make a difference. And in so doing, bringing their very best, like what is their best in every moment, and being open to being stretched or stretching themselves, because excellence really is about how do we surpass, even if it's very so slight, how do we surpass the previous moment for the next moment. And living in those very small increments, I think, contributes to the success. And so I created, as part of my Dr. Didi Dynamo work, and the Dr. Didi Dynamo really came out of this continued, from that defining moment of being told that the boys and the girls buses were going to different destinations, and implanted this desire to continue to make a difference in how do I model, how do I create a pathway, how do I create a construct that encourages not just girls to know that they can be powerful and successful, but really boys as well. Because ultimately, we don't live in silos, we don't exist in a vacuum. And if I'm just doing the work of empowering girls or increasing representation for kids of color, and I'm just doing that in a box without communicating that message to the wider audience, then ultimately every time that girl or that underrepresented kid goes out into the world, into the environment where now they are trying to get a good education, or they're trying to function and feel valued in their job, or they're in a corporate environment and they're trying to move up the ladder. Every time they show up in those environments, what will ultimately happen is that they will meet that ceiling, because the environment has not made the mental shift. They have not made the mindset shift that we all bring very, very sort of significant worth, value. All of us have a diverse set of skills and talents that we bring into our environment that are critical for the success of any entity. The diversity of thought is something that is extremely important. And so if we don't educate and we don't have our kids, all kids, internalize those messages and basically break down the limits and the barriers that says that we're different because of how we look, because of where we're from, and that difference defines the ability for us to interact in a productive way, then if we don't do that work from the very beginning, then we're going to continue to spin our wheels and we're going to continue to be on the hamster wheel and essentially go nowhere. And so when I developed the Dr. Didi Dynamo series, the construct that has come out of that is really this ecosystem of learning. The same ecosystem that I was a part of, because that empowered me to be able to raise my hand. The ecosystem that essentially marries, all of the considerations and the components to raise and create an environment that will positively impact our kids for them to go on to be the next leaders, to be the next developers, to be the next innovators. And I have called it, taken creative license to call it the Williams Integrated Educational Model. And the reason for that is really paying homage to my parents, because it is from their work and from their essentially laying the groundwork and the framework for Hubert and I and my brothers to be raised in a way and an environment where we believed that we could show up and be our truest selves and be valued for our truest selves and not be afraid to speak up. And if the graphic for this ecosystem really encompasses what is the intellectual or the academic, the importance that our kids still need to learn, they still need to have a facility with internalizing, integrating information and then applying it, the recognition of the social components, the importance of connection, the recognition of mindset and the emotional growth, and being able to apply these positivity principles to the way in which you think about your life. And then really the physical and the physiologic components of this ecosystem is extremely important, because we have to really be able to feed our bodies and our brains in order to show up to be successful in any components. And I'm going to just take a few minutes to just really break down, I love thinking about things from the perspective of, how can I, package it in a way that is easy to sort of remember. And the first, and so I'm going to break it down based on this mnemonic of ecosystem. Ecosystem, so E is expectations. And I think, traditionally when we think about expectations, many of the, when we think about expectations, it has mostly been studied in kind of the employee-employer setting, which is, what do employers expect of employees? That you show up on time, that you're part of the community, that you bring your best work, that you are part of the team. What do employees expect from their employers? That you create an environment that's conducive to them being successful. But we don't see this often necessarily in the school environment. And certainly one of the things that we have not really emphasized is not just when teachers and students are in an environment, being able to really create a dialogue around expectations of each other, but then what do the kids expect from themselves? And so being able to really have kids articulate what do they expect from themselves, because this is where you begin to do the work of the inside out. It's not always about what does someone else expect of you, and what do you expect of someone else, but what do you expect from yourself? And so doing the work and creating the numbers of kind of pathways to those tools that begin to really facilitate those conversations about expectations so that kids feel empowered in the classroom. And as you think about this, and as I go through these, be mindful that this can really be applied across any environment, because what we're really doing is creating a culture. See connectedness, connection in community, and you all do this. I mean, Judy said you all do this so well here. I mean, like, your whole purpose is about global citizenship, is about lifelong learning and creating an environment where kids are really going to embrace how can they be great leaders and stewards of the information, and creating a community of belonging. But kids need to feel as if they belong. They need to feel that they're connected. And there are a number of I think, thought leaders that are doing the work related to loneliness and connection and what's happening as we're seeing this startling increase in depression, in anxiety, in suicide, in our children, in our teens. Teens is the second leading cause of death, that's suicide. And 85% of college students feel like they're overwhelmed. 70% of students, teenagers between 12 and 17, 70% of them said that they feel lonely. So these are things that are very concerning, and we can't get to healthy teenagers and thereby healthy adults if we don't facilitate the connections. And connections have to go deeper than sharing partnerships and projects, et cetera, et cetera. It's like, how do you really create the opportunities within the classroom for kids to connect at a deeper level, to be able to form those bonds that recognize who they are and where they're from, and to really build that in with a set of intentionalities that really creates the opportunities for kids to feel as if, as they go through their school day, that they feel as if they're seen and they're known, and that it presents the opportunities to break down what are many times misperceptions, what are many times unconscious biases, what are many times sort of unconscious and subconscious negative stereotypes, that without having that real opportunity for intimate connection, that we lose, and that kids, social media is a huge issue, as you all well know. And the message for me here is also about, as we bring the positivity culture for our kids at school and at home, that the work really starts with us. When we think about the habits of positivity, when we think about social media, we also have to think about how are we showing up? What are we modeling for our kids? Because we know that in the classroom and at home, it's all about not so much what you tell your kids, but what do you show them? And so we have to do the work of developing these type of mindsets in order to allow for our kids to behave similarly. I'm going to just lump kind of the O and the two S's together, because I think we all understand the importance of executive functioning, of problem solving, and of critical thinking. And those are things that are embedded in the curriculum here. I see, Lucas and Jacob, and I see the curriculum, and I'm very impressed that, that is something that is extremely, extremely held, in high esteem here, and it's something that is a constant part of the curriculum. The interesting thing is that, if we look at the Program for International Student the Association, where this is this world metric, the PISA scores, that looks at performance of the United States compared to other countries. The United States actually tends to fall in the middle for achievement in math, in science, and in reading. But and that has been relatively flat, even though we spend the most money per student on education. But I have to say, the thing that I think is encouraging and provides some hope is that the employability of the American workforce. So when you really think about sort of what's happening with students and what the students here shine in, is they shine in creativity, they shine in innovation, they shine in their employability, because they're developing those skills that are appropriate and are important for becoming a creative part of the workforce. So it's not to say that we don't have a lot of work to be able to be done in achieving, sort of trying to get to the metrics and honoring the amount of money that we're spending on education, but certainly, at least, we can be comfortable that we're seeing the impact of curriculum that tend to at least encourage and focus on problem solving, critical thinking, and organization. Moving on to the U and this positivity culture, and I think that when we think about inside out, really the most important part for me is who am I? Who are our kids on the inside? How can they connect in to that feeling of self-worth, that feeling that they are important, that they belong, and that they're actually here to do something that no one else can do, and understanding what is their why. And so this focuses on being able to build identity and character and confidence and mindfulness and metacognition, and all of these things are an important part of a culture that continues to really, I think, model model and encourage kids from this living from this place of positivity. When we think about I'm going to move to, let's say, the T, which is to inspire our kids to think like a treasure chest. And I think as parents, we have to be very conscious about what it is that we're pouring into our kids, what it is that we're thinking about our kids, what are we communicating. As teachers, we have to be very mindful, because if we think about our children as treasure chests, meaning that they're born with this treasure and that everything that we put into it is something that is going to impact on them in a significant way. And so if we're very conscious about putting positive and affirming things into our kids' treasure chest, those are the things that when they go into that treasure chest to connect with who they are and identify their value, what they're going to find are all of these things that have already been there, the things that you've placed in there as teachers and as parents, and they can really use those things to kind of give them that sense of hope, give them that sense of worth. If we're putting unconsciously negative things into the treasure chest, then what happens is, what we say, well, I'll say oil flows to the top, but there's, other bad things that flow to the top. When you go into your treasure chest, what you first bump into is that very negative, that negative thing that has been placed in that treasure chest. And so if we can really create that image that kids have a treasure chest, and anything that we put in and out of it that we have to be very conscious of. The other thing that I think about when I talk to kids about treasure chests is that here is where your habits of positivity come in, because it's a filter. And everything that goes into your treasure chest needs to be subjected to the filter. Is it creating a solution? Is it something that you can convert into an opportunity? Is it a positive or a negative? Is it something that aligns with your purpose? And is it something that you can extract a way of being thankful? And if it does not align or comply with any of those 5 characteristics, then you literally, need to be doing kind of, excavating and getting rid and getting those negative things out of your treasure chest, and being very active and conscious about it. And so this is a work of being active with our treasure chest. And here is, if we think about this treasure chest, we know that these values, as we talk about culture being the values, part of your values are really built on what's put into this treasure chest. And then from if you remember the graphic from before, that takes you to the rituals and to symbols. So these values really inform what you believe. Here is where your unconscious biases, all of these things live. What do you believe? And then from this, it takes you to what do you care about? This becomes a part of your why. And then your why then informs what you do. And then what you do comes right back into your treasure chest. So you really see that this cycle of positivity is that if we're raising kids to think about themselves as empowered and making a difference in the world, it really comes back into reinforcing for them their value, which then starts again with their belief, and you create this cycle of worth that really is essentially a cycle of impact. And the environment of positivity, we've already talked about why positivity is important, what it plays out to, what it translates into, and what practicing the habits, both for parents and for children, why that is extremely important. And back to just a reminder of the habits. Now, this is the other reason for the M in ecosystem, is that importance of role modeling and of representation, in that where do kids see their worth? Where do they see their value? How do we know that other people that don't look like us, that are not from where we're from, how do we know that those people are valuable unless we see them represented? How can our kids know that they can be something if they've never seen it? You can't be what you can't see. And so the work of Dr. Didi Dynamo has been about this work of representation. And this is extremely important, because when we can go to, and this obviously talks about how this has impacted on my why, and lack of diversity, girls in STEM, positive role models, and so on and so forth, telling powerful stories, and a work of healing, teaching, and telling stories. But the important thing that I want us to really leave here with, when I think and I talk, and my vision for Dr. Didi Dynamo, if you look at the attributes or the characteristics of who Dr. Didi Dynamo is as I talk to all kids, she's kind and caring and smart and powerful and insightful. She's a leader. She's positive. She wants to make a difference in the world. She's diligent and disciplined. She's a team player. She's an innovator. She's creative. If you look at all of these descriptions of who Dr. Didi Dynamo is, not one of them mentions anything about her external characteristic. And this is really the important message. But we are connected by the commonalities of who we are and what we're here for, and the value of caring for each other and the positivity in that first really are these common threads that connect us, that are then enriched by the differences which bring a texture. If you think about our lives and you think of us all as a fabric, it brings a texture to the fabric, a richness to the fabric that allow us to really have a life that allows our creativity and innovation to continue to grow and expand. And so the Dr. Didi Dynamo book series and the ecosystem of learning is really about continuing that work and that mission of vision of encouraging children to believe that there really are no limits, that there are no limits to who we can love, there are no limits to what we can learn, there's no limits to what we can vision, there's no limit to what we can believe, and that we can be very mindful and intentional in our home, at school, in really bringing all of those elements to bear to really continue to build what you guys have already established here, which is to build the whole child, the whole kid, and not just the whole kid from the outside, but to really delve down into the inside and have them connect to that unlimited part of who they are. And so before I finish up, I also want to say extreme thanks to Evandra, my sister-in-law, okay, so this is, okay. I want to also recognize Evandra because, with our two boys, we really, as we call them, the three musketeers, we really work diligently in our family to really live this life, to model this life, to model this belief system. And one last short story, just because I'm a storyteller. Our son Mark is 13 and he's at Roxbury Latin in 8th grade, and he came from the Chestnut Hill School, and it was a huge transition. Very rigorous. The volume, the pace of work is just unbelievable, and it's staggering. And he one day about a month ago came home, and he was having a Latin test and a French test all on the same day, back to back. He had a ridiculous amount of homework, and he came in and he was just like, tomorrow's just going to be a bad day. It's just going to be bad. It's just going to be a disaster. And I couldn't get him out of that. Just everything is just going to be a disaster. And so, the next morning I'm sitting and I'm not just like, oh my God, this is terrible. Like, did we make the wrong decision? Like, this boy is usually very positive, and now here he is, just gloom and doom. So I'm really gotta kick my Dr. Didi Dynamo habits of positivity into action. I'm like, what are we gonna do? I'm not like, where are the list of tools that I'm gonna have to employ? And so he comes home the next day, and I was like, well, Mark, how are the tests? And he said, oh, it wasn't too bad. And I said, Mark, I was just really concerned. You just seemed so negative yesterday, and I was just really, really concerned that you seemed like this environment was getting the best of you. And he said, but Mom, it was hard. And but just because it was hard doesn't mean that I wasn't going to get it to roll up my sleeves and give it my best, and I wasn't going to fight. He said, whose child am I? You're Dr. Didi Dynamo, And I said, well, is RL really beating you down? And he said, yes, it is. But he says, I'm beating it right back. And so I felt, this is essentially a manifestation of being surrounded by these 5 principles, which is setting up a culture for, life's going to get tough. It's going to get hard. You're going to have some challenges. But ultimately, we get to choose how we show up, and we get to model for the rest of the world how we show up, and we get to really make a difference in how people think, in what people believe, and that whatever you can do, you embrace it fully and know that not even the sky is the limit. So I thank you so much for being here, and would love if there are any questions.